All right, here we are, folks. Monday, June 1st. Disturbingly, frighteningly close to the end of the year, let alone everything else that's going on in this country right now. Or this world, quite honestly. It's not just us. But we're gonna focus a little bit more on class, at least at this point. So if you guys take a look in our Schoology, there's not a whole lot left. We're down here Monday, June 1st. Got two things for us. Number one, we're going to talk about the brown tree snake. Last week, I assigned you guys to do an invasive species like presentation. So today, what I want to go over is what where else have we seen this? What other examples could we really do if we do a deep dive for how invasive species have affected different ecosystems? And we're going to finish with our brown tree snake, largely talking about how we control invasive populations, and that will lead you down into the SciShow video for today. So, should be pretty straightforward. Why don't we just get started? So, when we talk about invasives, remember from last week, the whole idea of this is something that shouldn't be there that's been introduced. Now, are there useful invasives? Sure, there are, but they are rare. Normally, an invasive species is ecological Armageddon to the native species. It's coming in with all of those new adaptations that the local native species don't have a counter to. They've never evolved with that challenge, so they are not prepared for it. And so things just start to collapse. And you can imagine looking at any food chain or food web, what happens when we start to knock out a species here or there? How does that affect the rest of it? Does that now overstress one population so that they start to decline to the point where they can no longer sustain the populations above them? Does it just straight sever one line, one food chain, because now that key component maybe gets eaten by something else? Right? So now we're going to take a look at once we have something bad, it's established, how do we control it? How do we attempt to? Well, quite honestly, and as disturbing as it is, this is one of the major methods, the overdone application of pure force. Now, this is actually something that happens kind of here in New York right now for one particular invasive species, which is also what's pictured there. And I'm not going to go over it because somebody may be working on that or want to work on that for their invasive species thing. But this is what we do. Sometimes it's just about killing it off as wildly as we can. The organism you see that's being targeted down here in New York State has a kill on sight order. There's no hunting season. There is no limit, so you are free to kill as much of it as you can find with absolutely no concern from any form of government agency. So really, when an invasive species moves in, we got two choices. We can either eradicate them and simply attempt to eliminate them, or control. Now, usually what ends up is we start with eradicate and then we end up moving to control. Now, eradication usually means that we're going to do something drastic. We want to kill off an entire population, so we are going to use fire. And there are other species that will lose part of their population in the process of us doing so, but we term this as acceptable because the invasive is so dangerous, so disruptive to the native ecosystem that we're willing to accept some collateral damage in order to control it. Now, this is not usually successful. Unfortunately, by the time we know that something's a problem, it's normally past the point of eradication, and then we automatically are left with only control, which is still trying to eliminate them, but now we're not worried about trying to eliminate their entire population. We only want to eliminate it to maintain control over the ecosystem. So, for instance, this is like the idea of an invasion curve, right? And as that line goes from green to yellow to orange to red, the population is getting bigger and it's spreading. If you notice, we normally don't become aware of it until it's reached this point. Their population already has to be pretty large by the time that we tend to notice. And at this point, eradication is highly unlikely. It would require a lot of work to happen. The only time that we can realistically eradicate is down here in this range. And arguably, right now, it looks like that's what we did to the murder hornet, the giant Asian hornet, because we detected them when they were very small in the population. No new ones have been found in almost a year, outside of a couple of individuals. And so, as of right now, we think we may have gotten that. Now, obviously, it is possible that their population is somewhere up here. And if so, then they are moving up towards this point where we'll start to see them around, and by then it's already too late. To put this in kind of more of a control aspect, this is what it looks like, right? So you've got that yellow area. There are so many there. They are so well established. Their density is so high that we just don't even bother. Right? Like, it would be nice, that's the goal, but we're not going to start there. We're going to start at the red. We're going to start by trying to control the spread of this invasive by targeting the smallest areas that are moving out from that high density center. And then if that's successful, we'll move into the orange area, which is going to get more expensive and take more time because now we're just getting the outliers of the core. And that's usually what control is about. We know it's here, we know we can't stop it, so now it's just an issue of let's try to limit it so that it's going to have the minimal impact that this species can. There are different ways to do this. I'm not really going to go over this, but if you're looking at this picture saying that's ridiculous, that man is on water skis wearing a metal spiked football helmet, carrying a sword. You are correct in all of those statements. Instead, let's look at something that isn't in the US and therefore something that I don't need to step on toes by going over. And we're going to go with the brown tree snake. Now, the brown tree snake is native to out near Australia, right? And the islands of Indonesia, a little bit northeast of Australia. And in its home habitat, it is just a normal part of the ecosystem. But this snake was somehow introduced to the island nation of Guam in 1952. We think that it got into the landing gear of planes that were on runways. And it coiled up, and then all of a sudden the plane took off, so it just held on and survived the trip. And then it was on Guam. Now, why is this bad? Guam has no snakes. No snake species existed on Guam prior to 1952. This is the one and only snake species on the island. And so it brought snaky adaptations. But snaky adaptations are not something the locals had ever seen. They had no idea how to handle it, the animals there. And without ever facing this kind of a threat, they were not prepared for what it was going to do. In the 60 years since its introduction, the brown tree snake has driven 9 of the 11 native species of birds extinct. There's only 2 species of birds left on the island. All of these that you see are now gone because the brown tree snake is what we call a generalist feeder. Most of you are probably seeing that in researching an invasive species. They feed on a lot of different things. The brown tree snake likes to eat bird eggs, but it will also eat birds. And so, if it finds a nest, it doesn't matter whether it finds young, adults, or eggs. Finding a nest is food time. And as though that's not bad enough, over half of their lizard species, I couldn't get a good number on this one, are now either extinct or believed to be functionally extinct because, as a generalist, it will also eat lizards. Anything that's small enough to fit in its mouth. Additionally, it eats bats. And out of the three bat species that Guam had, two of them are now extinct. Now, I just want you guys to imagine a food chain and then imagine knocking one organism out and the effect that would have as it shifts and moves, as predators now need to change what they're eating, how that's going to influence the herbivores below them, the producers below them. Now imagine eliminating 9 species of birds. Let's say the safe number I found was 5 species of lizards and 2 species of bats. What does that do to the rest of the ecology of this island with that kind of disruption? Hopefully, the thought is just terrifying. And of course, if you're talking about losing birds and bats, what does that mean that Guam has lost most of? What kind of niche, what job that these organisms do that is so very necessary for all the other food chains, all the other food webs on this island in order to continue? They lost their pollinators. Birds and bats are what move a lot of pollen around. And now we see dozens of species of plants that are starting to become endangered because without these organisms to spread that pollen in order to spread the seeds in order to ensure their growth, they're starting to die off. Right? It's dominoes. Right now, if you are spending any time watching the news in America, and this is June 1st, 2020, so we're 6 days into riots starting to pop up all over the place, then you should be really familiar with the concept of a domino chain and how one domino knocks over the next and the next and the next. As a matter of fact, Trevor Noah from The Daily Show just posted a phenomenal video. It's about 20 minutes long about exactly that and about how important it is for people to understand this domino chain because that's how we're getting pushed where we are because dominoes are falling over and they're hitting other ones and it's amplifying the effect and it's going from individual dominoes into huge groups of dominoes. And eventually, if enough of them are falling at once, there's no way to stop it. Look it up if you guys want to see a really really clear, very well thought out point of view on everything that's happening. But all right, let's say that you don't care ecologically. Let's say that you are part of some organization that says forget the environment, not important. The only thing that's important is money. Pure capitalism, baby. Well, let's show you what this does economically. Because it is important to take into account the human side of things. Well, right now the problem is that the snakes are so now heavily populated in Guam that they are daily, regularly crossing power lines. Now, if you've ever seen a bird perch on a power line, you probably understand that that bird is fine because you see it fly away or it sits there for a bit, whatever. You will never see a bird touch 2 power lines and fly away, though, unless it's as a smoking little comet that's going to impact the ground. Because as soon as you cross 2 lines, now you're providing a bridge for the energy to travel. through yourself. Well, this process is costing them $4 million per year due to electrical blowups. Now, in addition, it's important to note that the brown tree snake is a rear fanged venomous snake. Now, rear fanged means that the fangs are way in the back of its mouth. It's designed to inject an animal that it's already bitten and is starting the swallowing process. But a human hand or fingers can reach there, so they're seeing hospitalizations because of it. And the last one is really hard to understand, but what's not hard to understand is that graph down at the bottom, and that is the loss of tourism to the island because they don't have half of their native species anymore. If their ecology starts to break down, people don't want to spend money going there, especially when they're likely to wake up with a snake in their boot. But take a look at the numbers: 593 million to 2.5 billion in possible lost revenue. Now, if you look below that, there's a chart looking at the GDP, the gross domestic product of Guam. And you can see it's taken a couple of hits, but the trend since 2012 has been pretty clear. And 2018 was the first year that they were in the negatives and their country was going into pretty bad debt to try and keep running. This is what happens when an invasive species becomes so established that it can knock down the agricultural center, needs, and commerce of an entire country or an entire area. It can get insane. Now, at this point, you really can't control it. And in order to demonstrate how much you can't control this, I've included all of these numbers so you guys can check that out. I trust in your ability to read pretty well at this point. But just take a look at the number of snakes there are and then the size of Guam. Guam is less than half the size of our state. And so now, all of a sudden, starting to understand, imagine if New York State was losing $500 million from its yearly budget, let alone 2.5 billion from its yearly budget. That's going to cause a lot of harm. So, being able to control an invasive becomes unbelievably important. And that's no different anywhere. If you're going to attempt to control it, you can't do nothing. Because sitting in the burning house, like the meme says, saying this is fine is not going to save you or help anything. Your inability to accept a danger does not mean that danger isn't happening. Like climate change. So, which means we come down to the other three possibilities. How do we control this? Do we bring in some native predators? Do we introduce another species in hopes that that species will control the brown tree snake population? Do we release some sort of disease into the population in hopes that because there are so many of them, they will spread rapidly? Excuse me, yawning. It will spread rapidly and kill them. Or do we try to eradicate by shooting, trapping, poisoning? Well, Guam looked at all three of these. And basically, what they kind of decided was they can't go with the predator route. Like, their ecosystem is already falling apart so badly, they don't want to risk bringing another disruptive species in. It also didn't help that all of the predators of the brown tree snake are also generalists. They're not specialists. They don't just eat brown tree snake. They eat all sorts of things. So they're like, no, no, we already have one of them. Not again. So option number two, what about a disease? Well, if you can get one, that's ideal. If you could release a disease to control a population, that is easily the best choice because it's density dependent. Okay, I'm going to draw some pretty uncomfortable parallels with COVID right now, but when people or species are massed in one area, it spreads more rapidly. It affects more of them. It kills more of them. As population declines and spreads out more, the disease becomes less dangerous because it doesn't have the vectors to spread it. Unfortunately, they couldn't find a disease for the brown tree snake. Snakes and reptiles don't have a whole lot of diseases. And the ones they did find would affect reptiles in general. And now their reptile population is, critically endangered. So they don't want to further risk what does remain. So the last thing that they opted to do, and this is currently the method going on in Guam to try to control the brown tree snake, is mass poisoning. And they do this by what seems like one of the most ridiculous methods possible. They fill toilet paper tubes effectively with dead mice. And then they kind of tape a pill of acetaminophen, Tylenol, onto them. And then they fly a helicopter over the forests and they just drop these tubes with streamers off of them so they get tangled in trees up in the canopy. And then the snakes are in the canopy, they smell the dead mice, they can reach into the tube, pull the mouse out and eat it. They eat the tablet. Acetaminophen, Tylenol is deadly poisonous to most reptiles, and they fall over dead. Now, I ask you, how successful do you think this control method is? If your answer is not, you win! The brown tree snake continues to be an issue. Decades now that they've spent fighting it, and they just don't have a better method. Now, that's not true for everywhere. It is important to note that some places have actually used what we call biological controls. And in this case, we're going to hop back to Australia. If you remember, we talked about the rabbits as an invasive species there. Well, they found out that there was a rabbit specific virus, Myxoma, Myxoma. And it's a coronavirus. You can see a picture there. And basically, what it does is when it infects a rabbit, it causes them to grow these sores, these like fluid filled pockets of infection, basically. And they can happen around the body, but especially around the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And so, by reducing the rabbit's ability to get food and see where it's going and stuff like that, they start to die off. It was originally released back here about 1955. You can see it. You can see how the rabbit population dropped wildly. They experienced a 99.9% fatality rate in any rabbit that survived the myxoma virus. But then the rabbit population came back and they needed to try new biological controls in order to get that population under control again. It looked like they finally managed it around 2003, but you can see when this graph ends around 2009, the line's coming back up. How did this happen? Why did some of them survive? Why do we have a population here that can come back from something like this? What happened? So the rabbit plague was there. We released the myxoma virus. It killed a bunch of them, but it didn't kill all of them. Why? Well, it all comes down to natural selection, folks. Natural variations. Some of the rabbits were resistant. Not many, but enough to survive and then enough to reproduce. Believe it or not, this myxoma virus has been released multiple times. And every time it's been released, it has caused less, or it has had less and less success controlling the rabbit population throughout Australia. Now it's estimated that over 90% of the rabbits in Australia are resistant to myxoma because they've already gone through it. Their ancestors did. Only the ones that were resistant survived, so only the resistant ones passed on the traits. Soon, the entire population is resistant. The downside of biological control is the fact that it is biological, which means biological laws and principles still apply and can still take place. So I wanted to give you guys an example about exactly how this process works, what it looks like when we do get a problem infestation, and hopefully to give you guys an idea. Ideally, a biological control is always what we want. A biological control is better than spraying or poisoning or having people in helicopters rain lead down in order to try to take out an invasive. So, hopefully that clears things up. Tomorrow, we're going to start moving into the more humany impact part, which is pretty much where we're going to be for the remainder of our very short year. I hope this helps, has clarified some ideas. Please remember to get those invasive presentations to me as soon as one can. And otherwise, I'll see everyone tomorrow.